Welcome back, everybody, to the evening session of the first International Women in Neuroscience Parma workshop. We are so happy to host the conversation between Dr. Siri Hustvedt and Dr. Anna Ciaunica. It's going to be terrific for sure. Probably before a proper introduction of our guests, Dr. Vittorio Gallese want to say a few words as the director of our sponsor, so the Lab of Neuroscience and Humanities. Hi, Vittorio.
Hi, thank you. Hi, everyone. What can I say? A dream comes true, literally. Why I'm saying so? Because at the end of a very interesting day, made of exciting talks about the neuroscience of social touch, we have the opportunity to learn more about these and other issues from an artist, an essayist, a great scholar. I won't mention all the fields where I feel intimidated when I speak to Siri Hustvedt, and with another dear friend, Anna Ciaunica, who also combines a variety of perspectives in her work, as she's a philosopher and a cognitive scientist. This is the reason why we decided to start with the lab Neuroscience and the Humanities, to create bridges, to foster discussion, broaden our perspective, which sometimes narrows down to what boils in terms of experimental procedures, statistics, which are, of course, of crucial importance, where we need to have a larger picture. And the two guests of tonight will definitely broaden this picture for all of us. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, although not in presence, maybe next time, hopefully soon. And I leave the floor to the great Martina and Francesca, who organized all this event. Thank you. Thank you, Siri, and thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Vittorio.
Thank you to Vittorio for this opening. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Siri Hustvedt. She's a worldwide known novelist and essayist. Her works have been translated in many than 30 languages. She has a PhD in English literature from Columbia University, and she's a lecturer in psychiatry at the Weill Cornell Medical College in New York. She's the author of several scientific papers and a generous interdisciplinary lecturer, as you will see. Among others, Siri Hustvedt received the Los Angeles Book Prize for Fiction, the International Gabaron Prize for Thought and Humanity, and the prestigious Princess of Asturias Prize in Spain for the body of her work. What distinguishes Siri Hustvedt's work is her ability to address old and existing intellectual dilemmas, originally blending the contribution from neuroscience, psychiatry, philosophy, and thus offering an interpretative framework that do not attempt to solve the dilemma in itself, but rather to substantiate them with new perspective and point of view.
So, Anna Ciaunica is a philosopher and a prominent researcher in the neuroscientific field. Currently, she is PI at the Center for Philosophy of Science of the University of Lisbon and also the main coordinator of the Network for Embodied Consciousness and Arts. Her research activities is intrinsically interdisciplinary, focusing on the atypical forms of bodily self-consciousness occurring in various conditions such as the personalization disorder, but also on the development of minimal selfhood in utero as a process of co-embodiment and co-homeostasis. So we can see how this conversation will take us, not only because our guests are prominent scholars and also thinkers, but also because their research activities converge in the topic of this workshop. So now, Siri and Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Anna, who's going to ask? We wrote 3 questions for the others. So who's going to go first?
Okay, so I'm going to go first.
Okay.
Okay. So, but I need to read my question because my question is really complicated. So I'm a philosopher, so I'm allowed to ask complicated questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to start with the concept of the self. because I think this is a concept that we all kind of like share across all fields, all disciplines, and it's kind of like central to the Western culture. What is really interesting, though, is that across all cultures and times, humans somehow actively try to kind of like get rid of the ordinary sense of self and to leave behind the ordinary sense of self, to detach from this daily self and to become someone else. So, for instance, some people can meditate to leave behind the sense of self, to lose oneself. Other people take psychedelics, you know, to go some various trips or self-perception. Some of us actually just simply get drunk, you know, or travel to different places. But some of us actually create other selves via creative writing or, you know, actors or movies or filmmakers, screenplayers. So you are one of those. So you're an artist and you're a brilliant one. And one of my favorite novels ever was The Blazing World, precisely because who's that, right? The novel.
You just.
English, there's the expression putting oneself in other people's shoes. I like better the French expression because we involve the senses. It's like we like to say you put under somebody's skin, se mettre dans la peau de l'autre, you know, to take the other people's perspective. So here's my question to you. So how does your ordinary self relates to all these new selves that you create? And what is the role of the senses, and particularly touch, because it's the topic of the workshop in this creative process? So why do you think people try to leave behind the ordinary self across all culture and all times, and to become someone else? Yeah, so that's my first question.
And it's a deep question. It's a very deep question. You know, I think that the move that I think many of us have praised is a move towards thinking about the self as obviously embodied. And I think for the two of us and for others, it's also relational. So the question is, how do we think about escape if in some way the other is already implied in our notion of the self? And is, for example, escape by drugs, say, or meditation, which is interesting, it's a form of losing the self, or as you say, the ordinary everyday self, the same or different than creating others in a work of fiction? I think there are some things that are related, and while I was working on The Blazing World that has 19 different narrators, I started to think about the connection between, you know, what is now called dissociative identity disorder in psychiatry and used to be called multiple personality disorder earlier in psychiatry's history. So for people who really have dissociation, they don't seem to have control over their alters, right? The people come out, and this has been related to trauma in different ways. The artist, I think, is probably not dissociating as much as entering into deep spaces of plurality, right? That we probably all have plural selves at some level because we're fundamentally inhabited by others. In psychoanalysis, they call it object relations, you know, that there are others in us. And it's, you know, I was introduced with the truth that I have a tendency to ask better questions than I can answer them. But there's something there that's, I think, very interesting. Now, when I was writing those people, I did not look back at what I had written before. I didn't go back to the text. What I did was literally felt the being of that other person. So it did have an aspect of trance reality, right? I would remember who I was writing, and then that person would inhabit me again. This, I mean, it does sound a little like, you know, mystical transferences, but you know, this hasn't been properly explored, I think, by science, and it's probably very hard to do it. But you know, I suppose there's some way of setting up physiological tests when someone is writing as someone else, being others, as I say.
Yeah, so the reason why I'm asking this is because I mean there is a huge debate in especially in philosophy whether there is something like a self, or if the sense is an illusion. And people say, look, basically you can lose the self, you can, you know, there is no such a thing like a sort of like metaphysical entity, like a substance, the self, so it can change through one another. But also, but that's I don't think that's a good argument, because you know, when you take, we were talking about the body as well, right? So the body also changes. Basically, we are never the same from one second to another, right?
Right.
Yet nobody would say there is no body, because the body is changing, right? Right. So the body is still there. The self is changing, that's for sure. That's what we can know for sure. So I think what I really like in this take that you have about being someone else and doing different perspective is that basically you show that there are changes in the self, transformation in the self, right? And become another, and that becomes I'm speculating here, but I'm trying to see how much of actually of those characters that you inhabit, the 19, they kind of like your pure creation, or they're more like your encounter with different people, random people that you encounter, and say, oh, that one should become a character, or at least some parts of it, or that a particular character, it's one of your reaction to someone else, as you said, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, I think it's probably a combination of things. So, for example, in that book, there's a character named Sweet Autumn, who began as, to be honest, in my mind, as a kind of kook. She was going to be comic relief. And as I began to, well, voice her, to be her, if you will, she became infinitely richer and more complex. Her past began to emerge for me, and I ended up giving her the very last word in the book, which was something I didn't expect. So what you're talking about now, which I think is very important, is that the self is a dynamic, moving process, right? Which does echo biological processes, right? That we're constantly moving and changing. It's dynamic, it's not static. And one of the problems, I think, in Western philosophy has been to fix it as a kind of entity that doesn't change.
And speaking about embodiment, do you think that, for instance, when you inhabit this new selves, did you find yourself, I don't know, moving around an environment differently, or dressing yourself differently, or, you know, drinking in the morning differently?
I think there are real changes. You know, I spent 6 years writing one of my novels, a novel called What I Loved. And it's narrated by a man, an older man. And during that time of writing, I actually felt that I was older. I was in my 40s. The narrator was 70. And I felt changed. I felt a kind of bodily alteration that then repaired itself after the book was over. But yes, I think, and you know, leaping from one person to another did feel a bit like having a disorder. But you know, so how do we determine selfness? It's clearly related to forms of repetition, right? Forms of repetition that bring meaning and allow us to recognize ourselves over time as repetitive creatures. This is you know, probably the best thing written on repetition, I think, remains Kierkegaard, where he says, you know, there's no such thing as absolute repetition because we have time. So repetition over time makes it impossible to have any form of exact repetition, but nevertheless, we recognize the similarities.
And when, so because I think, and this is the last question on this. Actually, this is another question to the first question.
Okay, good.
So, so the reason why I'm interested in this is because it's a bit selfish. Because you know, I work on self-detachment. So how you alter your sense of self and detach from yourself and leave yourself behind. In the case of like a clinical disorder, so that just happened to you, don't choose to be this. But also strikingly enough, actually, people that have this form of self-attachment, they tend to have very often as métier, I can't find the word in English, job, as a job, they are actors, right?
All right.
And this is kind of like counterintuitive because you say, okay, so yeah, so if you lost yourself, how come that actually can become another so you know, so good other, right? So convincing other. And then when I asked them this question, and the people, some actors that I know that suffer from cognition in London, they told me something that actually echoes what you just said. They said, well, but it's precisely by trying to become someone else that I kind of like build connections with myself, with the alleged self. Right?
Yeah.
And this is why it's a sort of like instinctive therapy that they have, which is like to try to, you know, forget a bit about the lost self, become some. So just really, really interesting.
Yeah. No, I think, you know, the very strange thing about writing, and I think this is true for many artists of different kinds, is that actually when you're doing it, you feel more alive. I mean, it's a funny thing to say, right? Because you are making something unreal, or you're creating a fiction or some kind of art object, or you're playing a character. And yet in that moment, you feel more truly and deeply alive and close to yourself in some way. So it establishes an intimacy with what we think of as the self by leaving it. Yeah. Now, do I get to ask you one?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. It has been generally recognized that although Western philosophy has been obsessed with death, it forgot birth. Plato's Symposium is all about pregnancy and birth, but he places natural birth below the philosopher's birth of ideas coming out of his head, relegating natural birth to the low mess of the body, the female body. Aristotle, who was fascinated by generation and a brilliant biologist, I think, in many ways, nevertheless assigned inert matter to the feminine principle and the active principle or soul to the masculine. As a philosopher, how do you understand the neglect of the universal fact of gestation, pregnancy, and birth? Every person begins inside another person. What happened? That's my question.
A lot of things happened, but I think I'll try to start with what I take to be the most basic one, from the basic one, and then all the others just like domino effects, right? They come from the basic one. So I think the basic fact, the starting point is something very simple, is that we are biological living creature, organism. And as such, we have well, a tendency, a drive to live, keep going, keep living, and it's something that we share with the entire living kingdom. And I think we know that we're going to die, so there is an end to it, right? So that's the basic starting point, is the fact that we know that there is an end, right? And there is one. That's the only certainty that we actually have in this life. And then it's quite surprising, because if whenever I ask my students or people, I say, tell me what's the opposite of death, almost 90% of the people tell me life. But it's not life, actually it's birth, as you said, right? So it's the beginning. That's the opposite of death. It's the birth, not life, right? Yeah. And I think that from that distinction, from the fact that actually we know that we're going to die, and there is an end, right, to it, then we try to find some compensatory way, psychological way, because we are scared, we are afraid, we are, humans. So we're trying to find a way to figure out what's going on, so how to cope with it, right? And one way to cope with it, I think, is, okay, so you can see that somebody is dying and the body disappears, the body disintegrates, right? And that's something you can see, that's visible, that's the material, right? And one way to resisting to that disappearance of the material, of the death, is to say, wait a minute, there is something perhaps immaterial that actually stays there, right? That doesn't disappear, and we can hang to it, right? And sort of like, safety nest, and say, okay, so that's the thing that actually, there is something ideal there that actually doesn't disappear, and everything here is kind of like, mirror. And I like this expression in Greek. They say soma sema, which is like soma body, sema tomb. So they consider that the body is a tomb for the soul, and the soul is the material thing that will somehow. So now going back to your question. Well, obviously what is happening is that we live in a world in which we have what we call a ontological asymmetry of the birth. This means that regardless whether we are male or female, we are all born from a woman. Yeah. Right? That's asymmetrical. In a philosophical, in a thought experiment philosophy world, would be like, okay, so female give birth to female, male give birth to female, to male, or the other way around, right? Let's say you have a world where only female give birth to males, and that way around. That would be the symmetry. But we don't live in a symmetrical world from that side. We live in an asymmetrical world, which means that the power of birth is given to one gender, for the better and for worse. Yeah. So because the woman gives birth and gives life to the body, that's something that we can see, automatically we somehow associate her with this disappearing stuff, right? Yeah. With nature, which kind of like disappears and it makes you ill and makes you trouble. But we don't want to stay in that suffering bubble, and we don't want to face it. And then we try to transcend that by saying, okay, but that's just like it's happening here and now. We don't need that, but because we actually have an immaterial soul, mind, whatever ideas, call it. But the basic idea is the same. It doesn't disappear, it stays there, right?
Actually, yeah, I just one little comment. I think there are modern versions of this, right, which are not even religious, but they serve the same role. For example, genetic determinism, the idea that DNA is you. So it's like, instead of you being this, process over time that eventually disintegrates, you carry on this DNA soul that that is like a way of saying, well, okay, this is the new soul. Epigenetics be damned, we've got this, DNA code program, whatever, and that's another way, I think, of evading the truth.
and relates with your question because I think it's one of the implicit reasons why the female body is kind of pushed aside from the scene because we don't want to know. Let's focus on what stays, Let's focus on things that can actually comfort us, right? It's like I can, grab this like abstract ideas and then somehow I'll, not going to die. But but that's a personal opinion. I think that's a coping strategy that we invented. And I think as a philosopher, as a female philosopher, I think philosophy is the most sophisticated way that we invented to actually try to ignore or push death aside. And the thing is, like, because we want to push death, implicitly we push birth aside as well, right?
Yes.
In the way.
Yeah. Good answer.
Okay, my turn.
Okay.
Okay. So it's actually connected with your question. So you argue so convincingly and powerfully that the Western school of thinking has pushed aside a female embodied being and its reproductive power by treating women as objects, a vehicle, or houses to fuel and transport the baby. So I did myself some work on this and trying to be very patient and careful, try to bring attention to this idea that our first experiences are fundamentally shared experiences, and that regardless of the fact that we are female or male, we're all born within another person's body, and that's a universal fact.
Yeah.
But your work actually goes even deeper than that and targets a phenomenon that is very tricky to describe, and very few people venture it in those murky territories. And you are doing brilliantly and bravely. And namely is this concept in between, right? What is happening between two organisms, right? And in between the self and others, in between the self and one. So what is happening between two living organisms? And you did some beautiful work on the placenta, I really, really like, and it's fascinating and overlooked. And I would like you to tell us more about it.
So you're absolutely right that this in-between stuff started a very long time ago. And it was always for me then about relations between two people, right? So Martin Buber was very important to me, I and thou. Freud's transference and countertransference, or the whole psychoanalytic concept of that between area. Husserl's intersubjectivity, Merleau-Ponty's intercorporeality, which he expanded on Husserl, and D.W. Winnicott's theory of play, right? Which is, his argument is that play takes place in potential space, which is neither the person nor completely the external environment. It's hovering somewhere between. These are very interesting notions. However, I think getting more involved in neuroscience and the sciences, I began to think about between areas that break down rigid taxonomies in biology itself, right? And thinking about the between, I mean, it sort of like came to me, I thought, it's the placenta. The placenta is the between organ par excellence. And it's also universal, right? As you say, pregnancy, being inside someone is what we all share as human beings. We also share the fact that we cannot be born without a placenta. And if the placenta does not develop correctly along with the fetus, both the fetus and the mother are endangered, right? It's a crucial organ. And in other cultures, it was always treated with reverence as a kind of twin or double of the fetus, which, as it turns out, is kind of what it is, right? It's something that grows alongside the embryo, all in the first 3 months. Actually, the embryonic being is nurtured directly by the uterine lining of the mother. And we know that now. And actually, in 2020, there was a paper written where they discovered that early fetal, what they often call the fetal placenta, is occupied by a lot of maternal immune cells. So it's an ideal form in a way of mixing, right? This is like, and mixing is often anathema to mechanistic science, right? Science wants to draw lines for good reasons, for totally understandable reasons. But in fact, in biology, the placenta is only one place where these lines get blurred. And I'm very interested in that. And of course, it is also related to what we've said before, to forms of dynamism, right? So new thoughts about how, the brain works are hierarchical and dynamic, because the map version of neuroscience, you have like love and you find the spot in the brain, or God, or whatever, all that crazy primitive stuff, started to look pretty silly. And so now other models are coming up that are more dynamic, hierarchical, and thinking about relations, physiological relations. And so I'm interested in that. But what does it mean if you take the placenta as a scientific object, which is still in a very primitive state? There's so much we don't know. I mean, there's huge amounts. So what do embryologists mean, for example, when they say that before implantation, the blastocyst is interviewed by the endometrial cells of the uterine lining? They use these terms, or they have crosstalk. But actually, what it is starting to look more and more like is that the uterine cells check out the blastocyst to see if it's worth the trouble. and if it is, it literally pulls it in, right, for implantation. So the old idea of invasion, which is very popular in biology, everything is there. We have invaders and we have wars and we have all of this bellicose metaphors to describe what's happening, is actually a kind of dialogue. Now, the nature of that dialogue in mechanistic terms, which may well be discovered, is completely unknown. But it's fascinating because it brings up a bigger problem in biology, which is the question of agency. What is a biological agent, and how do we think about that? I mean, the placenta and actually every cell in the body is acting a lot like agents, right? So how do we pare that down in a way? And what does it mean? Clearly, for example, the fetus has forms of operational intentionality. This just seems, from sonograms, you can see these little, proto people having, gymnastics in the womb and licking on the umbilical cord and, scratching the placenta. I mean, all kinds of things are happening in there. And clearly there's learning taking place, especially in the last trimester. But again, I don't have an answer for this, but I do think questions should be asked, right? And the fact that the placenta is the organ that creates microchimeras of both mother and fetus and later infant, right? These cells mingle during pregnancy, and it's not accident, it is on purpose. And that, in the maternal system after giving birth, those cells may aid in helping get well from illness, or they may be harmful. in other ways. So isn't it just fascinating?
It's like what you say about the first steps is like the interview. I like that term. It's like, whoa,
Yeah,
tell me
it's
more
like,
about you, you know, where do you come from? Who are you, you know?
and that's basically like, are
Yeah.
you good enough for me? I mean, that's actually the sort of news coming out of recent research, is that there's some kind of intracellular dialogue that then results either in the blastocyst just, you know, going through rather than implanting. And, you know, the other weird thing about the placenta that is something very interesting to think about in evolutionary terms is that unlike lungs, hearts, brains, livers, placentas are species specific. They look really different. So studying a mouse placenta is not going to tell you a lot about a human placenta, which is why they've started the human placenta program in 2014. And they're, you know, doing, I think, research now that should reap tremendous benefits. I hope so. But that's a weird thought. Like, why are our brains really very similar in many ways to rat brains, but our placenta, you know, the placentas that are produced are extremely different. So this has something to do with morphology, clearly, right? How we turn out. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because now we know that actually that interview is crucial for a successful pregnancy, because most of the miscarriage actually arise on that period. So it's a sort of negotiation.
Yes.
And in any negotiation, things can go right, but also wrong on both sides, right? And yeah, it's clearly, it's a really a dialogue. But I'd like to jump in on with the distinction for the word of agency, because you use this, and I think this is really important. But I'm going to do a bit my picky philosopher.
Yes,
so what do you mean by agency?
Go for it.
So agency can mean a lot of things. So a cell can be an agent, a single cell or single organism. So I look for sugar and avoid toxin.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's right. So there is, in philosophy, make the distinction between the property of being an agent, that's agency, right? Then the property of initiation and action, being the agent that controls an action, which is a bit slightly more sophisticated than the first thing, is just being an agent, that's an agency.
Right.
The other one is the property of like controlling an action, making intentions, intentionally, I'm going to intentionally things, to be, and that's a different understanding of what an agent is, right? And the third one is even more sophisticated is the sense of agency. So I have the feeling I am in control of that action. Right? And you can see that when things go wrong, then break down, that you can see clearly that they distinguish, right? Because people can say, I am the agent doing these things, but I don't feel like being the agent in control of it. So I think in the case of like the cells communicating, they are agents in the first sense, right? So these are things doing stuff. that's agents, right?
Yes. No, I think you're right, and it's additive, right? So that if we think about agency and having these scales with the differences are crucial, obviously, and especially when you're thinking about human beings and how we discuss the question of a body subject, right? That the body subject is not the same as a whole, or, you know, as the cells within that body subject that are working away and are do not have that sense of willed intentionality that the whole subject has. No, these are very important distinctions. I totally agree. Okay. Let's see. Oh, here. Okay, this time I found this, I remembered this poem. And because I've been reading your work now for quite a while on depersonalization, and even we did something a little bit together. And I thought about this poem by Anne Sexton, and I've cut it short. So, we don't take up that much time. And I'm just going to say ... where I've cut. But it touches on your work, I think, rather extraordinarily. And it's work that's been made more urgent in the pandemic. What happens when we're, not touched? And the relational significance in human development of haptic perception, which is something you're clearly working on and have worked on with Katerina Fotopoulou, who is part of this conference. So here it is, The Touch by Anne Sexton. This is the opening lines. It begins, "For months, my hand was sealed off in a tin box. Nothing was there but the subway railings. ... And all this is metaphor. An ordinary hand, just lonely for something to touch that touches back. ... The trouble is that I'd let my gestures freeze. The trouble was not in the kitchen or the tulips, but only in my head. My head. ... Then all this became history. Your hand found mine. Life rushed to my fingers like a blood clot. Oh, my carpenter, the fingers are rebuilt. They dance with yours. They dance in the attic and in Vienna. My hand is alive all over America. Not even death will stop it. Death shedding her blood. Nothing will stop it. For this is the kingdom, and the kingdom come." That's the whole last stanza, which I think is so wonderful, where she says, "My hand is alive all over America."
Yeah.
Okay, you take it from there.
Yeah, it's really beautiful and captures quite nicely this idea of like disembodiment and self-detachment in depersonalization. And so this condition is sadly the third most common experience or symptom in the general population of the anxiety and low mood, but is understudied and unacknowledged because it's so difficult to describe. So what do you mean you don't have a sense of you being you? So it's you, but you don't feel like being you? What do you mean, right? So it's really difficult to describe and highly pervasive, and people feel detached from themselves, from their body, from the world. And because they feel detached from their self and the body, they also feel socially isolated, right? They lose interest in people they like, in the hobbies they like. So basically they do things on automatic pilot, so to speak. So I started to investigate this because as a philosopher, I was obsessed with the importance of like the subjectivity of our experiences. How important is basically bear in mind that every experience is basically necessarily a subjective experience as linked to a certain subject, right? We cannot talk about experiences. I mean, we cannot talk about consciousness without talking about experiences.
No.
Cannot talk about experience without talking about subjects having those experiences, hence subjective experiences. And I think that's really important. And what seems to be the case in the personalization is that the very property or character of the subjectivity of our experience is altered. It's not lost, because people can say, doesn't feel like being my hand, but they clearly self-referentially correctly identify themselves. And this is what distinguishes them from, for instance, from psychosis or schizophrenia, where they basically buy into the story that there is somebody else, really a stranger. Right? Whereas in the case of depersonalization, the reality testing is intact. They're completely aware that whatever you experience is subjective phenomena, not the reality itself. And hence this is exhausting, because they know that they shouldn't feel this way, but they feel this way and they try to adapt. And this is why it's so invisible from the outside, because they behave more or less kind of like typical people, right? That's not observable from the outside. And Joe that recently wrote the book about it has this beautiful expression, I think it captures very nicely, says, it's so sad that a condition that makes you feel invisible, because it's what they say, feel invisible and real, it's also invisible in the society, right? So you can't be seen by others and can't really see yourselves. And interesting enough, it is related with the topic of this conference, is like people, when they come into the state from various reasons, it can be trauma, can be drug use, cannabis, can be depression, can be traveling to new places, many other things. They find coping strategies, they invent coping strategies, because life finds a way. Life, you want to, go on and live. And one of the most interesting things is that when they feel that self-detachment is really go deep, they start tactilely interacting with the world, touching objects. And if they're lucky enough and they have a partner, they literally, grab the partner. And I know cases of people that basically, when they go into that panic mode, they literally spend entire day clothes literally on the back of the partner, right? Yeah. So the physical presence, the tactile presence of the other puts them back into the body. Or they say something like, I really like when people scratch my arms or twist my arms or scratch my skin, because it puts me back into the body, makes me feel cared for. Yeah. And this is something I felt in your poem, is that, well, there was this just like hand, I know it's mine, but it's in a box. Mm-hmm. So it's somehow detached from me in a separate reality, and I live in my head. But then something happens, so two hands, go together. And what is interesting about touch in relation to the self is that it's a dual sense. So this means that you touch something, and if you lose track of where your hand is, if you touch an object, you gain information about where the object is, but also information free where your hand is, where your body is. And going back what you said about COVID and what we experience right now. So feeling detached from your body makes you detached from the others. Now, the question with the pandemic was the other way around. So obviously, you can't ethically isolate people to investigate the impact on the sense of self. You can't do that. Nobody should do that, right? But now we kind of had to do that, and it was kind of like we had to isolate and we had to detach from other people. And if you didn't have a partner, say spend some time alone. So we said with some of my colleagues and collaborators, said, well, let's see what is that way around, right? The impact of like being isolated from others. What is the impact on the sense of self? And especially if you interact with others less proximally and less tactilely, because, well, it's the virus, you shouldn't touch things, it's danger. So, and you can't see others because they potentially can infect you and everything else. So you're literally, again, in the bubble, right? And it's true that we found that basically being isolated from others increase, and also having this type of like distal interaction, distal type of activities increases depersonalization, the sense of self-detachment. So that's indirect evidence of the fact that, actually it's quite important to stay literally in touch with other people on all the levels, because it's it's for what we were talking earlier, it's about It is mandatory. It is ontologically mandatory. We can't even I remember we having this talk with Katerina many years ago. We were talking about touch and everything. I said, yeah, you can't survive without another. She was telling, and she's right to say that. And the philosopher, metaphysician in me said, you can't even exist without another.
That's right. You can't. But I think this, the fact about this kind of, especially firm touch, if you think about, in utero and the experience of growing by late pregnancy, the fetus is, of course, really kind of mushed in there. And after birth, many cultures, they imitate what that feeling was for the newborn by swaddling them, by rocking them, so they're imitating the mother's walk. All of that becomes, part of early childcare. And I think in vulnerable moments, or moments when people are feeling dissociated or depersonalized, that there is some memory, right? Body memory of this intense sense of being held, which echoes the tightness of the late womb experience.
And there is also the fact that when you are in a liquid, like amniotic fluid, you are inevitably touched all over the
Yes.
body. Right.
Yes.
So you have feedback, sensory feedback from the largest sensory organ, and this is some work that I did with Laura Crucinelli.
Yes.
She did wonderful work on affective touch as well. Yeah. So this idea, this is basically how we first meet the world, right? And it's different from the interoceptive because even though they kind of like develop from within, they remain, so to speak, kind of like intimate.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Whereas the tactile experience is literally at the border. It's in between.
Yes.
Right? It's in between the two, right? And so the skin is not a frontier. It's a bridge, right?
That's beautiful. I'm going to remember that. Not a frontier, a bridge. I like that very much. But no, I think also that, one thing it's very interesting that science has a tendency to avoid is what, for example, experience inside someone in amniotic fluid has to do with erotic life going on, right? It's like another wrinkle on the Freudian idea of polymorphous perverse. I mean, that was his idea, right? That we're all born with kind of erogenous zones everywhere. And so clearly there's some kind of line to think about erotic, the erotic as a process and not as some kind of genetic fixity, which is, a tendency that's going on now. But yeah, I mean, and people's response to water, right, which is different. I mean, I love to swim. You love to swim, I know. But some people have, hydrophobia, and what this means is an interesting question to ask.
Okay, so my turn.
Okay.
Okay, that was a beautiful poem. I'm going to ask you a permission to use it on the slides. Okay, so my last question is about the future. And this is something related with what Vittorio said at the beginning when the interdisciplinary dialogue between humanities and science. I think this is actually quite an important point. Because everybody seems to believe that interdisciplinarity is kind of like key to advance our knowledge about the world, about ourselves, because it's like we kind of expanded everything into so tiny little boxes that basically we can't see the forest because of the trees right now, and we really need to bring the dialogue together. But interdisciplinary dialogue is encouraged in theory, but it's difficult to put in practice. And I can testify about that because I'm doing interdisciplinary work and I need to put up some, struggles every day. So I wanted to ask you, what's your take on this, in particular the dialogue between art and science, and what type of bridges, because you said that you liked as well, bridges, we should build upon those two approaches, like between art and science?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for it. As you know, this is I really sort of split my reading time between reading in the sciences and reading philosophy and literature and history. The reason it seems to me this is important for anybody doing any kind of work. There's a very low to the ground practical side of this, which is that by reading around, and I don't think casual reading is enough, right? You have to really take, say, the discipline that's not your own discipline, that you didn't grow up with, so to speak, very seriously and learn about it. But if you do that, it creates a kind of flexibility of mind that allows you to solve problems in your own discipline. So a scientist who cares about philosophy or the history of science, for example, when she encounters some kind of seemingly intractable problem, I have found it becomes possible to move around, take another perspective, and actually, if not solving the problem, at least opening it up to new questions that will provide a real headway into, into seeing it differently, right? So specialization creates rut thinking, right? There's only one way to go. And I see it often in papers and it's both the humanities and the sciences. It is not limited to, what we think of as logico-scientific thinking. It also happens in the humanities where certain ideas are just taken for granted and they're never questioned anymore. So that's the practical part. And, since we're in a pandemic and we have a horrifying, environmental crisis, we're on fire, we're flooding, and things are going to hell, it does seem that flexibility of thought for people who care about this is intensely important, and I don't think it will come through narrow specialization. So dialogues of the kind we're having now, I think are really, really important, especially when, I think, as is the case with us, although we have obviously have had different trajectories and know different things, there's an openness of communication, which makes it possible for us to, to really understand each other. And I know, because I have been at interdisciplinary conferences and people just talk right past each other. I mean, literally different vocabularies, have no idea where the connective tissue, to use a biological metaphor, might be. And it's very disappointing. It can be kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is a struggle. But I was thinking, so here's my hunch. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, but we have the humanities and we have the science and we have art.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether we can use basically art as a sort of like bridge between the two, right? And the reason why is this is because, science wants to measure or get at the bottom of the things objectively. What is there? Right?
Right.
So not what I invent in my head, right? Humanities are about how we humans kind of like, you know, investigate the world out there and what's this all about, you know, why am I here? You know,
Yeah.
the sense of like me being a human and, you know, the sense of my life and everything. That's a very important existential question, so to speak, right? But what is really missing in between is going back again to my obsession about the subjectivity, right? But can we subjectively express something in a way that cannot be said by words in a certain way, like in a scientific way or a theoretical way, like by humanities, but being said, as you said, like with the poem that you described, right? So if I'm going to an audience and I'm speaking to some people, I take a description of, you know, the phenomenon of depersonalization, which is very nice, you know, and I take this poem, then I might have people in the audience that relate more, understand better what I'm trying to say with that poem rather than with the words.
Yes.
It's a way of like, actually, it's a way of entrance into the reality, the subjectivity, and taking subjectivity seriously, very seriously. Because that's a problem I think that we have, and I constantly actually struggle with this as a interdisciplinary scientist. Even like the last week I reviewed a fellowship application, and there's this description between qualitative study,
yes,
and empirical study. And I was like, well, but a qualitative study is empirical science. You know?
yes.
So automatically people tend to disregard whatever touches subjectivity or qualitative science as being like less empirical, right? Less sciencey, less reputable. And I think we should use artistic expression and art to bring that forcefully forward, to say, well, actually, this is quite important because it brings us something about the importance of subjectivity. And it's so immensely important and so visible and present in the arts, that we could somehow manage to create this.
I think it's, listen, I think it's a great idea to think about art as then a form of a bridge, if we're going to make another, or connective tissue, or however we want to make that. And you're absolutely right. You know, Jürgen Habermas, in one of his lectures, talked about the scientific fear of subjectivity. And he compared throwing it out to like basically sewage. And I think that's important to see how that prejudice about, you know, the personal, the phenomenological, is actually a deficit, right, in science. But, you know, we're not going to throw out the scientific method or, you know, empiricism. I mean, I'm all for it. But I do think that we need that kind of bridge, and art is not, you know, decoration, right? It is not life's decoration. And I think that, and a link or an association that's continually made between the arts and femininity has damaged it, right? Has damaged it. It's soft, it's fluffy, it's not serious, it doesn't bring us real knowledge. What brings us real knowledge is, you know, the hard stuff. But in fact, this is not true. And, you know, if you go back into the history of literature, you can find, you know, many ideas that appear first in a poem, for example, or in a visual work of art. And human beings, again, have been making representations, forms of abstraction about their experience for tens of thousands of years. We know that, right? And so this has to be part of what we think of as human experience. That, you know, as John Dewey said, you know, art as experience in his great book.
So we can say that humans have been artists way before they've been scientists, right?
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
So that creative urge, right? To make meaning, right? This is an interesting thing. And you know, how that relates to fertility and birth and all of that is an open and very interesting question as well. But human beings, whether they're male or female or in between, make. There's a drive to make. And if you can't play, as Winnicott would say, then that's a pathological condition, right?
It's a kind of a paradox when you think about it, because, you know, on one hand, people say that art is a bit like a luxury, right? So as a feminization kind of put aside. And on the other hand, when you can see the prices that people pay to actually get a painting, it's kind of like, wow, you know, so expensive, and, you know, want to invest into this kind of like, you say, well, you know, why is this kind of like paradox, right? If it's so not important, or why, you know?
Right, or why were artworks rescued, you know, during the Second World War at great cost, including the cost of human life? So, you know, it's fascinating to think about our values and what it means. And also, maybe more movingly, how people in dire situations, especially, for example, in the death camps, would keep themselves alive and by reciting poetry, for example, to one another. You know, people who were, you know, also fighting for survival, that art would return. People singing, making music, you know, at moments that are just fraught with intense difficulty. So, and during the pandemic, I noticed suddenly people were recommending novels. It's like, it's as if people intuitively know that they turn to art at moments of pressure and unhappiness, but it's not properly articulated in the culture why this is the case, right?
Mm.
Okay, I have one. We're going back to the self, but it's kind of interesting. So one of the most brittle questions of philosophy turns on the problem of the self. The paradigm change in cognitive science toward embodiment has created a radically different focus on how we think about self and selfhood. Rather than a floating Cartesian mind, we have a grounded body subject, to use Merleau-Ponty's term. Katerina Fotopoulou and Manis Tsakiris, who we both know, developed the thesis that touch is vital to infant development and feelings of self. And you and Katerina have further developed the idea of co-embodiment and co-homeostasis during pregnancy. I think this is really important to talk about. How do you think of that? I'll frame it a little bit, because we have about this tactile relation as self, but also as co-embodiment. I mean, this is really important to me, but I think you can articulate it well.
We already kind of like, we're already kind of getting there already with all the answers that we and discussion.
Yes, we are. Yeah.
So, so this idea that the first experiences, that how we first, so here's my starting point. So, you know, when I did my master in cognitive science, I did a master in developmental psychology, and I worked a lot on the social cognition, how you meet other people's minds, right? Meeting other people's minds and how you understand other people, you know, put yourself in other people's shoes and everything, perspective taking and everything else. And I, as a philosopher and also as a female philosopher, said, wait a minute, it's like, what if I shift the question? What if I actually ask myself, it's not now what is self-consciousness or self-awareness, but how do we become self-aware and how self-consciousness basically unfolds? And if you ask yourself this question, then you realize that way before you meet other people's minds, you meet other people's bodies.
Yes.
So I wrote a paper from my master with the title, which is not very good. I mean, at the beginning, my supervisor said, "Nah, are you sure you want this title?" I said, "Well, I want this title." So I put a controversial title, "The Meeting of the Bodies."
Yeah.
Because meeting of the minds, okay, I understand the meeting of the mind. Some people may say, "Oh, meeting of the body, what does it mean?" And yeah, so it's this idea that basically way before we meet and try to understand other people's minds, we literally meet other people's body at all levels.
Yeah.
And what is interesting is that when because we have this largest sensory organ that we have is so this means, and it's also, as I said, it's like it's in between the self and the environment, and it's also a bridge, not a frontier. So it allows basically exchanges with the environment. But what I really found fascinating, I didn't know about it when I actually had to read about it, what is happening in the womb. This is fascinating, is that fetuses spend a lot of time touching themselves, right? It's like exploring.
Yeah.
And the environment, you know. So, oh, who's this, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then with the time they kind of like develop kinematic patterns of like movements very differently towards the eye or the face of towards the body, because if you poke your eyes, oh, that hurts, you know. Don't. Yeah. But what I found fascinating is that, and I've developed a bit in this paper I wrote with Adam Safran and Jonathan Delafield on self-awareness in the womb, is that by touching your own skin, you basically enhance the innervation, the nervous innervation of your own body. So the more you touch yourself, the more feedback you get, and the more basically the brain learns, oh, this is mine, right? And you do this, you can do this only by touching things, right? So the tactile, and this is really fascinating and should be worked on it more. And I'm happy that people, you know, with this workshop and you know all the brilliant minds here, they actually focus more on this, because I think that's the bottom rock, not the vision, not how I see myself in the mirror, and that's the roots of the body self-consciousness, is how we basically emerge in relation to another. From the very beginning, and how can I use this, and why is this important? Because when things go wrong, right, instinctively go back to what actually helps you, right? So for instance, people with depersonalization, when they lose track of the self, they don't find themselves in the mirror. They don't try to look at themselves, oh, that's me, you know. On the contrary, actually, it has an opposite effect on them, right? Who is that stranger staring at me? And actually dissociates them even more from the self. And some of them basically also use sunglasses all the time to down-regulate the visual input, because the visual world, the visual input, and drags them into the outside even more, right? So they try to damp it down by wearing sunglasses all the time, but they increase the tactile stimulation and tactile interaction with the environment. This, and also another sense that has been neglected, which is also proximal, is olfaction.
Yeah.
There's also, for instance, I know one case where this person has a you know, perfume that she likes, and whenever she is getting you know, highly dissociated, she gives herself a powerful, strong shot of that perfume, and that puts her back. That over-sensory stimulation of the olfaction puts her back into the body.
Right. Yeah. Well, if you think about, again, both, you know, especially newborns, what, you know, it's obviously, you know, it seems quite right that the senses are mingled in some form of synesthetic experience, and that they're not separated in early life, but that the powerful acting forces are smell is really important, and so is touch. I mean, I have had a newborn. I've had that experience, and you know, you very quickly respond to the infant with all this touch, rocking, moving, you know, body to body gestures that are way more important than just looking, right? I mean, there's looking too, there's the gaze, but that's not the dominant business. Anyway, newborns don't see that well.
Yeah. And actually in the study, so it's a preprint, so it's under review. So it's like really preliminary, so it needs to be, you know, reviewed. But going back to the self-detachment in the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So we contrasted basically based on this idea of the proximal versus distal. So contrasted the time that people spend actually with visual activity, like Zoom meetings, like watching TV video on YouTube, or playing video games, right? Those are highly visual activities, and we contrast it with people that time that people spend on doing actually manual activities, like thinking with the hands. So I go back to your poem is like, get out of the head and get my hands all over America, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so like doing cooking, pottery, you know, things with gardening, right? And also physical activities. We found a significant correlation between the time people spend on Zoom meetings and self-detachment comparison with before the pandemic. So this means that we shouldn't spend too much time on Zoom. We have data, so that's not good, really not good. The brain doesn't like that at all. And we found a weak significant effect about the frequency of physical exercise. So the more you move your body, the more you're in touch with yourself, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of like makes sense, but it's not a significant. We entitled the paper "Zoomed Out?" interrogation point. Because we should probably be very careful with Zoom. And actually, I don't know if you and everyone else here had the same experience. I mean, I never become so much, doing physical exercise after this kind of like being also forced to have Zoom meetings. Almost like felt that I need to run and I need to do something with my body after a meeting, on the screen, almost like my body was telling me, no, get out and just move, do something with.
Yeah, listen, I cleaned a lot of closets. I did a lot of gardening, right? Cooking. My impulse, I mean, some of this is just like domestic hunkering down, but I cooked, for the two of us, but as if, we were going to be, it was sort of like beans and, deep cooking, stews simmering, on the stove. But I found that very therapeutic, actually, that kind of nourishing the people in your household. It was very helpful. I think both, that's both reflectively self-conscious and some kind of deep inner need to take care of things. Well,
yeah. So I think they are going to, we can go on forever, but they will kick us out.
Yes.
And I have a cat that wants to come in.
Oh, good. Where is she?
We are here. Yeah, we're still here. Thank you for this brilliant conversation. Really, thank you. I
so
enjoy
much.
every single question and answer, even if the dilemma is still there.
Yes.
And that's okay. that's super. So
Thank you both.
Thank you both. That's the okay. We have a lot of comments and questions in the chat, we will send it to you.
Okay,
So you can
good.
read it in the next days with your mind refreshed and without this so long Zoom or team meeting that we know is not a good thing.
Thank you, Anna.
So that's the very end of the first day of our workshop. There are a lot of food for everyone's house, I think. So thank you again. It was brilliant. It was amazing. And we are more than honored to have you as a guest this evening with us. Also, Vittorio, still thank you. We hope that we can meet in person soon and say it to you face by face. For the moment, to everybody, have a nice evening and see you tomorrow at 9:30. You can follow the same link that you used today. So arrivederci. Grazie ancora.
Grazie. Thank you so much, both.
Anna, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
nice.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, grazie.